Ok, donc on recommence. J'ai le plaisir de vous présenter Hilda Koopman, qui est Distinguished Professor à UCLA. Hilda est une grande spécialiste de syntaxe comparative. Déjà dans ses premières contributions dans les années 80, elle a eu l'idée novatrice à l'époque de comparer les langues germaniques et certaines langues africaines, dans son livre The Syntax of Verbs. Et là c'était les langues crou plutôt. Et ensuite, elle a travaillé encore sur beaucoup de langues africaines, le bambara, le wolof, etc., etc. Et aussi langue créole, langue austronésienne, donc une vraie linguiste comparative. Et aujourd'hui, elle va nous parler du projet qu'elle dirige depuis des années, TerraLing, sur la constitution d'une base de données user-friendly, je dirais, pour les linguistes qui ont des intérêts théoriques. Mais en tout cas, ça sera le contenu de la présentation de Hilda. Merci beaucoup d'être ici et bienvenue.
Thank you. So I will talk today about cross-linguistic, this database that I have been working on, and about a project that I'm developing about cross-linguistic variations for bare and indefinite noun phrases, and how we can use that to look for universals. Basically, what is the cartographic approach? So let me say a few words about the cartographic approach, a word that has been invented by Luigi. You can, at the most general level, see this project as, or the approach as trying to figure out what the structural atoms, the smallest structural atoms of human languages are. What are their characteristics? What are their combinatorial properties? So we saw that elements are being put together by merge. We try to find out which of these finer structures or hierarchical structures that we find in theoretical linguistics, which ones of these are universal, that is characteristic for all languages, and which ones are not. And in particular, what is excluded? What are possible languages that cannot be generated by the systems of they have, so that the children actually cannot make hypotheses that are too large. So we can see language acquisition as basically filtering out, where theoretical linguistics filters out all kinds of possibilities that the children will not have to consider. So what we see in our, So what we see in the theoretical development is that there's ever more in-depth and fine-grained analysis of individual languages, guided by formal theories, which gives a increasingly sophisticated toolkit, both in syntax and more recently in semantics. It also shows an increased importance of cross-linguistic research. That is basically finding out what is universal stable across languages and what can vary, what can't. So my talk today is going to be centered around a cartographic project, where the main purpose is to set the stage for building a new data set in TerraLing, or the kind of database application that I'm developing. And that's about the topic of this data set will be the cross-linguistic variation of bare and indefinite noun phrases. What is I can show you, maybe it's going to work. Oh, seats, yes, autorisé. Oops, okay, no, all right, so when you, oops. Oh yeah, there we go. So this is the database. As it is now, we are working on a new user interface. And what you see here, there's different data sets. So there's a data set called SSWL, which I will talk about, the syntactic structures and semantic structures of the world languages. There are semantic databases, conjunction and disjunction. There is a database about anaphora. There is Cinque's Universal 20 database that we, an earlier version. There's a database about, a data set about quantification and plurality. And so we see here, now I hope that I can go back. That this database application basically allows you to set up a data set and does that in a very easy way. So what the database does is basically what it tries to do. It's a kind of a flexible, collaborative research tool for theoretically guided cross-linguistic research. Open access, open-ended, community-based, where linguists can pose data questions to others and answer such questions for their native languages, and where linguists can set up their own data set for their own research purposes. So the work I'm going to show you is work in progress, and it actually builds and improves a pilot set of properties that are currently in this SSWL data sets that I talked to you about. All right, so let me give you some basic terms before we start looking at what we know about bare nouns and articles. I have some basic terms here. So I'm going to use the term indefinite article, and bare nouns. So an indefinite article we see here for English, a cat is an indefinite article. In the plural, there is no definite article, so this we'll call a bare noun, so something that doesn't have an article. We see in French that we have an indefinite article as well, and we have no bare plural. You don't say j'aime chat, mais j'aime des chats for an indefinite object. Then we have the definite article, the cats, and in French, le chat, les chats. And then we see that within English you have a bare noun for something which is a mass noun in object position, for example, like I drank milk, and not I drank some milk or I drank of the milk. And we see in French you cannot say j'ai bu lait, mais you have to say j'ai bu du lait. So the issues here are, as far as semantics is concerned, there's a huge literature on these issues, is what component of meaning actually licenses the use of the? What is the doing exactly? When you use something like the cat, does it, this definite reference, the reference of cat, does it have the property of being identifiable, that is familiar, or does it have the property of being a unique kind of object? Or perhaps does it have both properties? Okay? So there is a very large literature on this. As far as the syntax is concerned, there's a question about what the structures are of noun phrases that we will call DP for determiner phrases, whether they actually have a special, when you have the definite determiner, whether the structure of the cat is something like this here, very, very simplified, because the structure is much more complex.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
No. Siri thought that I was talking to it. And so here the issue is whether an indefinite article and a definite article actually are in competition for the same syntactic position, or when there is more than one position where an indefinite is in a different position from a definite, but they just add in some kind of competition so that you only get one. Then when you have a bare phrase, the issues here for bare phrases, lots of languages have bare phrases where you have definite determiner phrases, whether the structure actually has a null counterpart of a determiner. So there is something that is a determiner, but in the syntax, but it is not pronounced, so there is no expression of it, or whether that level is just simply absent. So this is one of the problems that we have when you do analyses. If something is not present, you don't hear it. If there is no phonological expression, is it there or is it not there? Right? So good arguments for whether it is there or not, and they are very technical. The literature is full of these kind of decisions, and it's going to make a difference if you think that Chinese bare noun phrases, which are used so if you say something, I like the man likes cats, it's man likes cats, but it can have different interpretations. So is Chinese only having a smaller level? In which case your semantics will need to be different from if you have a zero determiner or not. And so there's a question of which component of grammar is going to account for the meaning or the correspondence between the structure and the meaning. Okay, so my question here is there anything in the field where we have a cross-linguistic database for this variation that we find in languages? So there's a huge amount of variations, it's very messy, and it looks like, kind of bewildering a little bit. So there is no database that kind of codes up what we know should be coded up. It's also a very difficult undertaking. So the kind of typological databases that we have, basically WALS, here's the link to WALS, World Atlas of the Language Structures, and its newer implementation, which is called CramBank, actually have the barest things about indefinite and definite noun phrases. So in terms of formal theories, these databases are actually not usable for linguistic analyses or theoretical in kind of a discussion. All right, so a little word about the history of what we know about the form and meaning of indefinite articles, what is known. So this actually is a core research for philosophers of language and has been going on for centuries, kind of trying to figure out what definiteness is or indefiniteness is, etc. But at the same time, we see that the issue is very complex, but there is actually an opening that I will talk about, which is the fact that there seems to be, the issues are complex in any given language, and the cross-linguistic landscape is very rich, poorly understood, but they're actually kind of striking form-meaning correspondences in completely unrelated languages. And this has been shown by a semanticist, a linguist, Florian Schwartz, who is at the University of Pennsylvania. And what I will do is I'll give you what he, kind of has discovered, and I will exploit that form-meaning correspondence to formulate a hypothesis about kind of the cartography of definite and indefiniteness, and show how it is kind of imperative that we build the notion of a form into the database. Okay, and I'll show you how to do that. Okay, so where is the formal research on this topic? So I'm having a quote here from Florian Schwartz in 2013, page 15, where he starts, his conclusion by something like, the theoretical debate concerning the proper analysis of definites has been going strong for over 100 years. Many important discussions are still to be had. Okay? That the whole literature, which is really huge, is heavily based on English, just because of the philosopher of languages who worked on this, worked on language, and were reacting and talking to each other and making progress. So here we have the philosophers of language, and we have basically formal semanticists and syntacticians. There's a list of people who are working on these issues. So mostly on English, but with Vanita Dayal and Kerkia, 2099. There's a lot of kind of interest in finding out what the difference is between English-type languages and Chinese-type languages, languages that do not seem to have articles. So, so there's the issue that what component actually licensed the use of the. I'm not going to talk much about this, but a little bit. There are cross-linguistic studies where there are languages which have more than just one definite article, definite determiner. So we know that, but there was no general theory of how to put these things together. And that's what actually Schwartz does. So Schwartz actually explores a morphological contrast between two definite articles in German, and then shows that this contrast actually, this contrast actually is found and also characteristic of languages that are unrelated to German. Okay, so here is where I'm going to go. Schwartz, there are two different determiners in German and other languages. This gives a generalization about form, meaning, structure correspondence. Then I'll talk about the historical development on the rise of articles in Indo-European, and give further indications that will give us further indication about form, meaning, interpretation, and structure. And then finally, I will show how to build the data set based on forms. All right. Oops. All right. So here we'll talk a little bit. I'll talk a little bit about what Schwartz actually found in his dissertation and all later work that he did on this topic, which has given rise to a lot of work on individual languages, where people are trying to see whether they can reproduce those contrasts in their own languages, or the language they work on. So what he does is he probes the referential expressions in prepositional phrases that we'll call PPs, what generally is the case for German is that you have two forms of the definite article. You have a strong form and you have a weak form. And if you put those objects or DPs in prepositional phrases, you will either be able to say zu dem, where there's a D here, so this is the strong definite article, or you will have zum, which is a contracted form where the D is absent. Right? And you might expect that this is just an option that the language has. You can pronounce your definite determiner in two ways, either by a strong determiner or a weak determiner, contracted. Maybe if you speak faster, you will contract. But what he actually shows that this is not a matter of free variation. So it's not a matter of the phonology. It's actually, there's much more to be said, and what you can say about it is really interesting. So what he does is he basically frames his discussion with respect to the classification of Jack Hawkins that he did in 2078. And what we see here in this table is there are different types of definite uses. Okay, the definite article can be used in different contexts, and you get different types of behaviors. Okay, so there is one type of definite use which is called anaphoric familiar. What's that? Well, if you have a context where you introduce an object, Mary bought a book and a magazine, then you can continue that context with a comment on one of these elements. So you can say the book was expensive. And we understand this as the book is picking up the reference of a book that is introduced in the discourse. So there's an anaphoric relation in the sense that this book here is not any book, but it's a book that is in the context, given in the context. Okay, so how does that work exactly? This is called anaphoric or familiar definiteness. And then there are definiteness that are given in particular situations, and they behave differently. So, for example, if you enter into a room where there's one desk, so there is no linguistic antecedent in the context, you can say something like, oh, the desk is in the corner. And you know that this talks about the desk which is in your immediate situation, and not any desk in the world, and this is a unique desk, okay? So this is a unique desk in a particular configuration. Oops. So uttered in a room with one desk. Then there's also the larger, so, or something if you say, well, you know, you're in a room, you say, give me the hammer. Okay, so it's not any hammer, but it's the hammer which is there, the unique hammer which is there in the context and that you're looking at. Or maybe not looking at, but that's the thing. Then you have larger situations. So where it's not just where the hearer and the speaker and hearer can see or locate the elements, but where world knowledge would help you. So for example, you have global uniques, like objects, the sun, the moon, the sky. You have unique individual objects, individuals, something like the prime minister or the mayor. Right? So you know the mayor of a town, you can talk about the mayor, which is in this situation of being in the town. Or you have a unique location, like the hospital or the center of the city. And then, so these are kind of ways in which these determiners, the actually shows up, but they have different properties, linguistic properties. And then there's a context in which there are ways in which you can use the definite determiner where there is no direct mention of an element which is interpreted. These are called bridging contexts. Mary bought a book today. The author is French. We understand the author here is the author of the book, but there's no book here. There's a silent element, there's something there that can refer back to an antecedent that is introduced in the discourse. Or suppose I'm driving down the street and it's really hot outside and the car has been in the sun, and I say, oh, the steering wheel was hot. And we know that this is the steering wheel of the car that was driving down the road. So these are called situations, immediate situation. Okay, these contexts are called bridging contexts, and they're actually syntactically very interesting, and have not, the syntax really hasn't been figured out, the details of this. So what does he find when you look at, what does he find? Sorry. Okay. Okay, so here basically what the findings are that if you have a strong article, a form of the article, and you get an example like one, Hans interviewed a writer and a politician, he did not get any interesting von dem politician, but not from. You have to use the from strong form for the anaphoric meaning. And if you use the weak form of the article, it's like unterm Schreibtisch, vom Hund, vom Bürgermeister, zum Mund, you use the contracted form of the preposition and the determiner. Okay, so that corresponds to the weak determiner. So this basically gives us these two different types of, this one is going to be the strong one and these ones are going to be the weak ones. And there are other semantic properties or syntactic properties that are associated with the strong form and the weak form. Okay, so which I'm only going to talk about the form here. All right, so what about the bridging context? So here we have a reminder of what the bridging context is. And then what we see is that the German weak and strong weak article actually can be used, also has a strong form of the determiner and a weak form of the determiner, that corresponds to these different types of bridgings. So the strong and weak article, so there's an example here, which is, the play displeased the critic so much that he left no good hair on the author in this review. This is an idiom, so he has to put it into a prepositional phrase. And you see here that the weak form is impossible and the strong form needs to be used. On the other hand, the case of the going down the street is the examples given in 5. It is you need to have the weak determiner. The fridge was so big that the pumpkin could easily be stowed in the in crispa. Okay, but not in dem. The strong form cannot be used. So basically, the summary here for German is that there are these two forms of the definite determiner behave differently with respect to whether the interpretation. So the strong determiner is used for the anaphoric or familiar determiner, and the bridging, the strong determiner is also used for the bridging cases with the author of the book, and the weak determiner is based for the situation, also for the situation of the bridging. Okay, so we see that these two forms actually have different kind of linguistics behavior in their choice. So the focus here is basically on my focus on the empirical generalization and the relation in the syntax. I'm not going to go into these analysis, but basically what this basically tells us is that if we want to build a database, form and context must be built into the database. Okay, so we must refer to the notion of form and not necessarily to the notion of what an article is. Okay, so that's the summary, and then generalizations about the form. So basically, as we saw for the earlier cases where you have bare nouns or nouns with a determiner, it looks like if you look at these forms, we see that the form dem is composed of two parts. And the weak form is the one that is contracted and doesn't have the D. And the anaphoric form is the form that does have the D. So this looks like they have different determiner layers. Okay, and the weak form is one determiner layer and the strong form is another. So what counts here is the fact that we have different determiner layers. So we want to find out how many of these different layers there are. If we look at other contrasts in Germanic languages, we find same kinds of contrasts. So for example, a Frisian dialect of Germanic has a weak article, which are called the A forms. And as you can see, it's a. And it has D forms, that are the strong articles, that seem to be related to these weak forms systematically. Okay? So basically, you have a weak form and you build another form that gives you the form, strong form. Beyond German, the same kind of contrast is actually found in many languages. But here, the strong form of the determiner alternates with a bare noun. Okay? So very frequent in African languages I work on. So Akan, which is a language spoken in Ghana, for example, has a definite determiner which is on the word follows the noun. It's in the end of the noun phrase. No comes from a determiner, from a demonstrative, and it combines with a alternates with a bare noun. So moon will not have a determiner, but the man in the anaphoric context will have a determiner. Sometimes you will have a language where there is a determiner which is just a tone, like a high tone prefix. For example, augments in some Bantu languages, they will show up in this language Bassa, which is a narrow Bantu language spoken in Cameroon, as a high tone prefix. So just very little phonological material, no segmental material, but it alternates with the bare noun. So what is found so far is the strong determiners, if there's a context, a contrast has always more material in form than the weaker form. And the weaker form can be null. Okay, so we can explore this because there are things that don't seem to exist. Okay, so it gives us a kind of a relation between form and structure. Okay, so we have two pieces of structure and one is bigger than the other. And actually, we can use it, look at the form and decide which way it is going to go. Okay, so that's part of it. Okay, so here the idea is, lots of questions to be asked. So are these strong and weak DPs themselves in different clausal positions? How does it relate beyond the noun phrase? It says if we look at an object, are these objects actually interpreted in different regions of the clause? Is there something that is a definite region and an indefinite region? Okay, so that's kind of part of the project. Now, if we have, can I just ask a question about the time? I have an hour? No, 50 minutes?
An hour would be fine.
No, 50 minutes. Yeah. So it's not that I have only 20 minutes. Okay, good. Okay. All right. So if we look at an indefinite, we only talked about the definite uses. If we look at types of indefinites, we can do the same kind of tableau, and we can say, well, if you say, I'm looking for a book, well, that can have a reading where you're looking for a very specific book. Or it can mean that you look some book or other, right? So there are at least two types of indefinites, probably more. And again, we can ask the same question about forms. Then we have also elements which are predicates, like Mary is a teacher, using an indefinite determiner. So how, we look at French, you can say Marie est un professeur, or Marie est professeur. So here it looks, sometimes we have bear and sometimes we have an article. Oh, what does that correspond to? So these are all kind of questions that are people are investigating these questions. So basically we have something like a hypothesis about what kind of the indefinite and definite field might look like. So demonstratives are in the strong region, and then we have a weak region that contains the weak definites, but also the specific indefinites, the non-specific indefinites, and maybe the predicate nominals. And maybe if we go down even farther to compounds, which are going to be bare. Okay, so we get kind of an idea of what the hierarchy of definiteness and indefiniteness might be. And that's what we would like to explore with the basis of kind of cross-linguistic data. All right. So this is basically, okay, there's two levels, at least. What do we know about, I keep touching this, which I shouldn't do. I should use a different bottom. Sorry. Okay. All right. So this is basically Schwartz. That's basically, get these, and he has these formal semantics. And so now people go out and start looking at this. And so there's a flurry of articles actually that have come out in the last 10 years, approximately. We get further into kind of relations, kind of insights from a study that my colleague David Goldstein has done and recently published a paper on, which is about what happened in the history of languages. There are languages that don't have articles and there are languages that have articles. Did Indo-European languages always have articles? No. So there's a question about what happened with the rise of articles in Indo-European languages. And what Goldstein does in this paper is that he uses methods from Bayesian phylogenetics to kind of investigate the history of the rise of definite and indefinite articles in Indo-European languages. And he bases this on a phylogenetic data set, which is published in Language. And it's 94 languages. It's based on explicit, formal, theoretical, theory-informed decision on how to count what is a definite article and what is not. But he doesn't make clearly no difference between strong and weak forms. What he does is there's this tree that I'll show you. He codes up all the leaves of this tree, the individual languages, and say, okay, what is the state? Do you have articles, no articles, definite articles, indefinite articles, both? And then, he does this on the basis of grammars and kind of information that's when it's available. Or when they're looking at the ancient languages, you have to rely on texts. So text for the corpus languages. He takes out all the languages where people say, well, this language has a definite article. And then another person says, no, it doesn't have a definite article. Right, so there's this disputed cases and removes them. And then what he found is, he basically uses Bayesian phylogenetics to answer questions. And what he found is this table here. This has both ancient and synchronic languages. And so there are 5 languages that only have indefinite articles. There are 13 languages that have definite only, no indefinite articles. So that's more like the African situation with Akan. There are languages that have both, 37, and then there are languages that have none, okay, 39. So we see there's a big difference between languages that, that have just one article and languages that just have both articles. So what is going on? All right, so here is kind of a phylogenetic tree. It goes beyond this page, it kind of continues. So, but let's look at the character state. Red means languages with no articles. Orange means definite article only. Indefinite, I don't know what this is, pale green. Indefinite article only. And then there are blue, languages that have both articles. All right, so this is the tree, goes back, approximately 6,000 years. This tells you something about the length of time. Little dots here means they are extinct. And so we get the old language, the ancient language like Hittite, Tocharian B and A. We have Sanskrit. They all basically have no articles. And then we look at languages that have definite articles only. So we see them appear in different ways. It's like ancient Greek had only definite articles, but no indefinite articles. But modern Greek has both. Right? So, and then we go to kind of Germanic languages, Romance languages, and we see, majorly both definite and indefinite articles. Right? So basically we see there is a historic development from having no articles at all to having both definite and indefinite articles. There's a question of which one came earlier in the development, indefinite or definite? Well, it already suggests that the surviving languages had definite article, right? The ones that we see. And basically definite article predominantly emerged before indefinite articles. Right? So that's basically, kind of the earliest attested languages had no articles, and then that suggests there were no articles present in Proto-Indo-European. Okay, but if we look at within the major clades, we see that there are languages that do have articles, but these articles, they are only articles that they're cognates the article system that you find are cognates in the group and not outside of that group, which basically means that the articles actually, they emerged within language groups and were not inherited historically. Okay, so there's a case from Proto-Insular Celtic, which had an article which I'm very surprised about its form. It's much too long for a definite article. But what you find here is that if you look at the languages that are in that group, they're all related to that form, but not related to any other kind of clades that we find. So what he then actually showed, which I think is quite remarkable, is that definite articles, they emerged 17 times. In the history of Europe, in the European, and indefinite articles arose 15 times, okay? And they arose within the language families, okay? So they're not inherited. Okay, is there a correlation? Did the definite article, for example, emerge before indefinite article? Or did the indefinite article emerge before the definite article? Or is there an interaction between having a definite article and getting an indefinite article, or the other way around? So you have different states. And what you can do with Bayesian phylogeny is basically you can, Bayesian statistics, you can rate the change and see if there is any difference in the correlation that you find. So does the rate at which an indefinite article develops differ if a definite article is present in the language or not? Or does the rate at which a definite article develops differ if an indefinite article is present in the language? And what he shows is, yes, these are correlated. Having a definite article in the language gives you an indefinite article faster than the other way around. Okay, so that's a new kind of finding. Indefinite articles developed at a faster rate among languages in which a definite article had already emerged. And it tells you something about the article trajectory. So you go from one way, no articles, bare nouns, blah, 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 to definite article, to both definite article and indefinite article. Okay, and then what you show is that this grammaticalization of, how do you develop a definite article? Well, it's the morphosyntax of the language that helps you decide which one is going to be, and that's an interesting linguistic question, but it plays an important role, right? So having one article, having a DP, helps you get an indefinite article. Okay, so then if we look at this grammaticalization trajectory of a language acquiring a definite article stable of different system, what can we say about forms and this hierarchy? And so it looks like it starts from the anaphoric definiteness and goes up, kind of trickles down according to hierarchy, so that you basically get something where the strong determiners come first, unique determiners can be silent, and specific indefinites have the same kind of problems. They can be bare or not. So the idea here is that these changes in language, they actually trickle down according to definite kind of hierarchical way, in definite hierarchical ways. Okay? And so language are going to be at different stages of development in these hierarchical states. Okay, so here's an example from a language I worked on, Vata, which has a definite article which is anaphoric, but it has no definite article when it's in an immediate situation. So if you say, give me, you would say the boy, blah, blah, blah. I read a book and a magazine. You will say the book was expensive. You use a definite article. But if I ask, open the door, it's going to be open door, no article. Right? So the immediate situation, no article. So that looks like there is a decline on the types of kind of synchronic systems that reflect this historical type of development. Okay, so there are many counterexamples, but and what kind of questions about what the formal kind of theory is here. But the fact that there's a correlation between having a form and a stronger form being more complex than a weaker form and a zero is something that we can explore with cross-linguistic data, right? So this is going to bring me to the TerraLing basic. Okay. Just one note about what to do about counterexamples. So we saw there were 5 languages that only had indefinite markers. And given Goldsberg's proposal, that should not be possible because you should have a definite article before you have a definite indefinite article. So are these languages really counterexamples? In fact, they are not really counterexamples to the fact that having a form and having no form has this implication, but having an article as a linguistic kind of concept, that's a problem. So what we see for these languages that are apparent counterexamples, these are all languages that are called so-called differential object marking languages. And what those languages do is, like languages Persian, is if you say something like, I read a book, book is bare, no article, no indefinite article. There's an optional indefinite article, but it's not necessary. You can have bare and be interpreted as an indefinite. And if you want to say, I have the book, you do have a marker there that is a case marker or preposition. So you get something like, I book, ra, read. And it turns out that so there is a marker for, and it must be definite, interpreted definiteness. So there is a marker for definite direct objects and no marker for indefinite direct objects. So the generalization about form still holds. There is a form that gives you this interpretation, or that's linked to this interpretation. And the other form, which is the indefinite one, doesn't have that form. So these languages in general, people are disputing whether this is a definite article because it only appears with direct object. But it behaves like something that marks definiteness, and it behaves in a way in which it's actually syntactically in a higher position than where the indefinites are. So I had a whole section on this that I'm going to have to skip. Okay, one more thing about before I talk about the database is, okay, so languages acquire definite articles. Well, that's called grammaticalization. What is the source within a language that gives you a definite article? And so there's varied, and if you look at the language in the world, there's various ways in which languages acquire definite articles. One is demonstratives. So demonstratives have more kind of forms inside of them. They are heavier in forms. And the anaphoric, the definite article, derives often from a weaker form of the demonstrative, where the demonstrative basically loses some of its parts. So this is like the dem and m cases for German. And then we have numerals for the indefinites, often giving you rise to an indefinite article. You have gender markers or noun class markers. Greenberg's famous article in 1978, which basically asked this question is, how does a language acquire gender marking? You have classifiers in the Southeast the Asian languages, like Cantonese has a bare classifier that is actually now used to express anaphoric definiteness. Same for Thai, as Peter Jenks has shown, and Bangla. They are all languages in which the classifier actually has taken over the kind of function of the definite article. Spanish with a for definite articles, for definite objects like human objects, differential object marker. Okay. All right. So this is an area, as you can imagine, there's lots and lots of questions and concerns that need to be studied in depth. But there is this generalization about forms and the generalization about what the syntactic or cartographic regions would look like or what they need to be. That gives you a kind of a handle on some of the research questions that we can explore. All right. So I'm going to talk about now, how do we construct a database that will be able to record what is known. So capture the empirical picture adequately, allow for comparison between languages, and serve as a resource for linguists, theoretical linguists. Right? So here I'll introduce the database, which I already talked about a little bit, and the fact that you can set up very easily with this database application that we wrote, a data set for individual research purposes. Now, there's two ways in which the basic data sets are organized. So we can have a single level database, which is basically like the general typological databases are. So you have a language or a dialect, it has properties of that language, and that's it. So we have a language like Vata, we have an order, we want to know what if it has preposition or postpositions. So we ask this question, is the order preposition followed by an object, or is that unknown, or is the order DP followed by a preposition, it's postpositional. And then you can give two values, yes and no, and a third value which is unknown, because we need to investigate that, right? But there's also a possibility of doing two-level data sets that we have started exploring earlier. So instead of having a level where you have languages and property of the language, so the one that's set, for example, there's a second level where languages can have forms, and you can define properties of these forms. So then you can compare different forms in a language, right? So our pilot, actually with Cristina Guardiano from University of Modena, has basically a flat structure, a one-level structure. And it gets into trouble. It doesn't get into trouble, it's doable, but it makes it very cumbersome, okay? So this is language-based, and so we have properties that we will need to continue and explore and augment to. So one of the properties, the variables that we have, one of the variables that we have been the variables that are currently in the database have to do with what position does the noun phrase occupy. Is it a subject or a direct object, or what happens with vocatives? If you say John, okay, how is that marked? Because often those cases don't get a determiner. What kind of readings do we get? So what's the context? Definite or indefinite? Very variable is what kind of noun do we get? Do we have a mass noun? Do we have a noun with unique reference, like moon or sun? What happens with proper names? Do they get an article or not? What happened with proper names modified by an adjective? And then we had actually basically three choices. A noun can be bare. Each of these subcategories had three choices. Can be bare. Okay, no articles. An article is possible. It's optional. but not required, or an article is required in a particular context. Okay? And then we had a property which basically says, is the article preceding the noun or following the noun? So basically what this requires, because it says, is there an article, you need to define what an article is. Okay, and now we get into this trouble. Like, you know, what do we do with differential object marking? Is that an article or not? What do we do with classifiers? So we actually defined this in a way that, okay, broadly, we just basically say if it is a classifier, noun class marker, case marker, add position, is only if there's a contrast between indefinite and indefinite, then we count it as an article. Right? So basically, we broaden the notion article, but we get into the Tower of Babel problem that everyone in any language knows what an article is. And of course, this is not, it's a meta-linguistic kind of property, we don't know what an article is. Right? So there's when you know, if you need to fill this out for your language, you need to kind of know a lot about, okay, I shouldn't think this is an article. Even if people say this is an article, it might not be an article, etc. Right? All right. And then basically what we didn't have different properties for definites and indefinites, like the ones that we already saw from Schwarz's work, that we need to get. Right? So we now want to kind of construct using the two levels. That is, the real notion we need is form. That is, what is the form and what is the properties of the form. So basically, for a language like English, we will have forms. So English will have, you know, kind of typological properties, and it will also have forms. That forms can be bare, it can be the, it can be a, but maybe we can add other forms as well. Because if we want to know what happens with definiteness, we might also want to know what happens with demonstratives and with possessors that all form kind of a picture of what happens with definite reference. Then we have French. We have forms. We have a language like Uyghur, a Turkic language, where we have bear and ni, which is basically a differential object marker, and maybe some other case markers like the genitive, which makes a distinction between definite interpretations and indefinite interpretations. Okay, and then we have an example of a form property. So for example, we want to know what is the form of an indefinite mass noun in object position. So we give a context to people, the instruction what to consider. Unmodified noun, so don't put modifiers because then you get into other problems. Generate examples that can be uttered in a particular context, so you have to control for context and for interpretation in that context. You identify forms, that is, what are the candidates that you might want to consider for articles, and then you basically show how to code for the marking. Can form X be bare, have an article, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so I'll show you the table of what this is. So for example of indefinite noun phrases in object position, we see that in English the form is bare, and you know there's no other form possible. And so we can put this in a table that might be easier to read it, make it easier to read this, where we have a table variation for English. So English would have forms, can be bare, a, or the. And then we have a mass object indefinite, count singular, like cat, indefinite, count plural, indefinite, mass object definite, count singular, definite, etc. So you have a kind of a long list of these. And then we see that in English, bare, mass objects are bare, and indefinite objects actually need a, and count plurals are bare. And then if we go down, we see that 0 means they have no article. That doesn't, you know, this form cannot appear in this context. And this is the context that you do get. And so we get a distribution within the language, which is very fine about what bare nouns can do. And then we can do the same thing for So here we see here, is a singular marker only. We don't get it in the plural. and then there's no mass object. You cannot say I ate a rice, okay? Or you cannot say I made the rice, okay? So it basically gives you this distribution. We can do the same thing for French. So one basically means this element can occur in this position, in this context, right, or this property. So in French, French doesn't have bare nouns. So this whole category is 0. No bare nouns. You cannot say j'ai mangé riz, j'ai vu chat, etc. for the indefinites. So, oops, there's a mistake here. So if you look at un or une, then okay, these are misaligned with de. So read this column as the column where you get du or de la. So j'ai mangé du riz ou j'ai vu des gens. Okay, so these two columns get mixed up. Et un is just going to be the count indefinite. J'ai vu un chat. Okay, it may not in the other context, etc. So here what we see is that we get a way in which we can compare different languages and see in what way they vary exactly. So this allows for forms to be added in the future, right? So you can start like this, but the data set is extendable. Okay, so you can add, for example, you want to find out what the difference is between some and so or some and bear. So I ate rice or I ate some rice. What's the difference in distribution? So we can add a form, some, and we ask exactly the same questions. If you have an indefinite mass object, can it have some? Yes. If you have a indefinite count, yes. I saw some cat, right? If you have a plural, can you have some? Yes, I saw some cats, right? So the way in which you can show these forms and the context is quite doable, and the examples are not very complicated yet. Okay. So what it can do is it can capture language internal variation and optionality. So, you know, sometimes you can either have an article or not. So, for example, in French, yeah, again, these two are mixed up. So, in French, indefinite mass noun cannot be bear, but in Italian, they can. Or they can have de plus article, right? So both of these are possible. So here you see that in French, you need to have du only, and it cannot be bear. But you see that there is optionality, or there is, you know, both of these forms are possible. So then the question of the linguist is, you know, how are they distinct in their distribution exactly? But you can capture in a language that it has both options, because both forms are possible in a particular context, in a particular reading. Okay. So it allows not only for added forms, but it also allows to expand properties. So we can have many, many properties and ask them from each of these forms. So for example, what we did not, the yes cases here are the ones that are already in the database for, that we have data for. So anaphoric for anaphoric plural. So what about the situational cases? We did not make a distinction between these. But what about when you have global uniques? We have that one, and we already see there is a difference between whether you can have an article or no article in the in the data that we got here. But we don't know anything about the Vata case, where it looks like when you have a direct situation like open the door or where's the key, you don't need to use an article. But things like unique objects actually don't have an article. So what you get is you know, I like to watch moon, no article. And so this difference between different types of uniques, whether it's anaphoric or not, or locational, or whether it refers to a person, languages seem to be sensitive to that distinction. So there's a finer distinction that goes on here. Then the specific indefinites, we made no difference between different types of indefinites, but that's what we needed to do. We have proper names. Proper names have not played any role in what I told you. But of course, some languages like German mark proper names and other languages don't. And we want to see what that correlates to, you know, how that kind of goes into the structure of the noun phrase and the structure of the clause. Then there are superlatives, other uses of the definite determiner, like la montagne la plus haute, okay? Where you have the highest mountain, so this is a superlative. Sometimes, like in French, you have 2 articles, and sometimes in other language you have 1 article, and some language you have no article. So that plays a, you know, kind of, when you talk about the superlatives, you can talk about the highest mountain in the world, or you can restrict it to the highest mountain that someone climbed. And you know, how are these differences going to come out of the database or be incorporated in the database? And then there are relative clauses. So there are languages that use determiners with relative clauses all the time, even if the relative clauses are indefinite. So how does that configure into the entire system of definiteness and indefiniteness? So the point here is that this is not going to happen immediately, but such a data set can be expanded when need arises. Okay, someone who's a specialist on superlatives and wants to find out what the cross-linguistic picture is, can write properties and the instructions and add it to the data set, right? So it's expandable. Okay, so the form-based properties, get to the conclusion. They avoid kind of what Luigi referred to as the Tower of Babel, not the Babel problem, which is basically a problem that we have within linguistics. So linguistic communities that study, you know, their languages or their family of languages have linguistic terminology that they use that is not the same as linguistic terminology that another group uses. Like Bantuists use different terminology to talk about clitics than Romance languages do, okay? So there's the kind of thorny problem of, you know, going through these notions. So names, they are just convenient because we know what class of elements they refer to, but it's really a form's distribution and interpretation that is ultimately what linguists must explain, and that's what children have, right? So that's what we need to kind of realize. What this actually, this form-based database, what it does is both the coding schema and the task becomes significantly simpler. So it's all kinds of very simple tasks that are individual. So they are broken down to small tasks where someone who is entering the data doesn't have to decide, like, oh, but I can think about that context and then it's possible. No, it's a particular context, and if that can happen in that context, then the answer is yes or no. It can record language internal variations. So then we know, oh, there's variation here. What is this variation about? Is it really variation, or are there finer distinctions? How do then, you know, come up with the tools to see if it's finer distinctions or not? It allows comparing languages, which is one problem that you have when you do comparative work. How do you know things are comparable? Well, you make it comparable because you give it controlled context, okay, as much as you can. Then the forms, as we just saw, they are expandable. So we can add also other indefinite forms or other definite forms, like demonstratives, that and this, they behave differently. Possessives, which also interacts with definiteness, and maybe the bridging cases. Allows asking about other contexts, so we're not really just talking about referential expressions in arguments of verbs or predicates, but we're also talking about predicate nominals, where their noun phrases are predicates and not referential in that way. Okay, so is all of this necessary? Yes, I think it is. It's a step forward towards the future of the cartographic enterprise. And, it's kind of where we're going to go in the next 100 years, this progress in the linguistic sciences. Okay. So, that's basically, so coming back to the generalization of forms, they can be tested as questions about the clausal cartography and this, give insight into clausal cartography in this domain. So, we can identify major regions and then try to see how are these regions, what is the fine structure in this region? Is there any? So a database project to support this type of research or theoretical research, in fact, can be done and I think should be done. So, well, the pilot actually, gave us very valuable information. It kind of showed us that this proof of concept, but it had its limitation because it's just one level, and so we have to get around it, make it very complicated. So both for users who are entering these data and for people who want to use these data, that's a hindrance, right? So things have to be kind of easy to learn, know what the structure is. Okay, so well, the enterprise will be complicated, but progress on this project can also help kind of the general TerraLing project take off. So we can make the interface better, and we get money for programmers, and we can compete with the typological databases and kind of create the necessary community. So thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to Luigi for inviting me. Thanks to Dennis Shasha and the architects of the TerraLing and the main programmers, developers. And lots of thanks to the members of the TerraLing community. You're invited to be part of it if you want to. We have regular meetings and we hope to kind of continue this project.